So what happens next? What happens next? You ever asked that question? In the years between the time I was 16 and 20, I went through a succession of cars. The first one was a 1976 VW Rabbit, and that was a great car. I don't remember how I destroyed that one, but anyway. Then the next one was actually my mom's station wagon. It was a 1978 Oldsmobile, and I used it as if it were an RV and stayed in it, and it was perfect because I could slide the surfboards in the back and head down the coast and stay overnight. Station wagons are awesome. I don't know why they went out of. I don't know why we don't have them anymore. They were great. And then my next one was actually a 1977 Chevy Malibu, and it had super huge doors that are probably longer than a lot of cars these days, but it was a two-door. And then I took my sister's Toyota Tercel, which was also a two-door hatchback, and I took it to Colorado with me when I went to college. And I used it in ways that it was not designed to be used. I took it on Jeep trails, and I took it off-road, and it did really well in the snow because it has front-wheel drive. And it was a wonderful car, but it finally broke down on a freeway as I was coming home into California. I was only about 10 miles from home, and it just completely said, that's enough of this life. And so my parents came and rescued me, and I have wonderful parents. They're very, very generous, and they have treated me very well my whole life. And they blessed me with a car that they thought would be able to put up with the kind of things that I put cars through. And so they bought me a Jeep CJ7, and that was a wonderful, a beautiful, probably my favorite car that I've ever had, a blue Jeep CJ7. And when I took possession of that car, I put it through the paces immediately. And my friend Alistair and I were in New Mexico, and we were heading back to Colorado Springs. And we'd gotten up really early at like 6 in the morning, and we started heading back to Colorado Springs. And we were coming down a mountain road. And the night before, there had been a big snowstorm. And so the roads were snowy and icy, and nobody was out on the road because, people who have well-developed brains know not to go out on the road that early in the morning when you've had a snowstorm. But I had a Jeep, so, we were good, is the way I saw it. And so we were coming down this mountain road, and there was a curve at the bottom, and we were coming down. And just as we got into the heart of the curve, the Jeep began to spin just like a top. And so we were just going around and around and around in this Jeep. And pretty soon, in just an instant, we found ourselves off the road, off the side of the little mountain, and on an embankment. And we were basically just like this, and the headlights were pointing into the sky, and what had happened is we had spun off the road, and we had just gone woof right into a snowdrift. And so we got out of the Jeep, and we looked around, and it was hard to get out of the Jeep because the snow was up above the doors. We had just gone woof spun right into that snowdrift. And we realized that we had just narrowly missed hitting a tree. As we were spinning, we could have spun right into that tree. And we also realized that it was very fortunate that we were facing this direction on the fall line of the hill, because if we had landed in this direction, we probably would have rolled. And I've seen cars spin off the road on icy roads and roll. It's not good. As they roll, metal starts to crumble and crush, and it's bad. And so we were very, very fortunate, and we realized how fortunate we were. But we were in this predicament. We were spun off the road, and we were like this. And so the question that popped into my mind as I got behind the wheel, we got out and we locked the hubs to put it into four-wheel drive, and then I eased it into four-low. And as I sat there behind the steering wheel, I thought to myself, what is going to happen next? Have you ever spun off of a road in your life and found yourself asking the question, what is going to happen next? Some of you may have asked that question, what's going to happen next, when you realized that you had written checks for more than you had in your account. And as you're doing your checkbook and you're balancing it out and comparing it to the bank statement, and you realize that you've overspent. Some of you have felt that question come up as you've sat in the exam room of a doctor's office, and as you sat there waiting for the doctor to come in, and that time, when the nurse comes in and they take your blood pressure and they ask you a lot of questions, that then the doctor comes and just asks you the exact same questions, so you're never really sure why you had to answer those twice. But anyway, in that time between the nurse and the doctor, when you're waiting to find out the results of a test, that question, what's going to happen next, comes in our mind. People in Scripture have had that question come in their mind. I'm sure that when Adam and Eve were banished from the Garden of Eden, as they had been pushed out of this wonderful, blissful existence, and they're standing at the edge, and they're looking out on the horizon of a world that they did not know, with all kinds of dangers, they probably were asking the question, what's going to happen next? And when Noah was floating around in the sea in his ark, and he had his whole family, and he had all of these animals, and they're just being tossed around in the ocean, drifting who knows where, I'm sure that the question, what's going to happen next, was floating around in his mind. And then there's David. He was a hero to Saul, but then he became an enemy of Saul, and he got chased all around Israel. And as he's being chased all around Israel and finding little places to hide, he was probably wondering, as Saul was chasing him, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? 10 or 12 years ago, this church was at its peak. This place was filled on Sunday mornings. People had their spaces all on every pew. If you came on Christmas Eve and you came into this building on Christmas Eve, you couldn't get here late and get a seat unless it would be a folding chair. This place had people, and there was a big budget, and it looked like this church was just going to take off. And then something happened. Something happened, and people started to leave the church. And year by year, there were fewer and fewer people coming to worship. Fewer and fewer people tithing to the operating budget. And slowly but surely, this church became half of what it was. And the question, what's going to happen next, is a question that we as a church are asking. What's going to happen next? Jeremiah asked that question, what's going to happen next, because he was somebody who lived in Jerusalem when the Babylonians came to Jerusalem and carted off all the people to Babylon. All the really gifted people were taken off to Babylon. But Jeremiah stayed behind. Jeremiah was one of the ones that stayed in Jerusalem. And he had to deal with the rubble of the Babylonians' invasion. And he has this prayer that he prays right before the Babylonians got there. He knew that the Babylonians were coming. Everybody knew that the Babylonians were coming. And he prays this prayer in Jeremiah. He prays, "O sovereign Lord, you made the heavens and earth by your strong hand and powerful arm. Nothing is too hard for you. You show unfailing love to thousands, but you also bring the consequences of one generation's sin upon the next." Jeremiah recognizes where he is, where he stands. He recognizes that things had happened in previous generations that caused him to be where he is. He continues, "You are the great and powerful God, the Lord of heaven's armies. You have all wisdom and do great and mighty miracles. You see the conduct of all people, and you give them what they deserve." So he's acknowledging where he is, where the people are. But he also, in this moment where he probably is asking the question, what's going to happen next? He's acknowledging where they are, and he acknowledges what has happened to get them to where they are. But then he also reminds himself, I think, in this prayer about the character of God. He remembers the character of God. He remembers that God is one who is powerful. God is one whose love is unfailing. God is wise. God can do great and mighty miracles. What's going to happen next? And then Jeremiah, he recalls God's track record. So he acknowledges where they are as a people. He remembers God's character, and then he recalls God's track record. He says, "You brought Israel out of Egypt with mighty signs and wonders, with a strong hand and a powerful arm, and with overwhelming terror." He remembers how the people who had been enslaved in Egypt, who probably were asking the question, what's going to happen next when Pharaoh told them to make bricks without straw? Jeremiah remembers that God brought them out. With a strong hand and a powerful arm, he saved them. And then Jeremiah is reminded of Joshua and how Joshua led the people into the land that God had promised. And he says, "You gave the people of Israel this land that you had promised their ancestors long before, a land flowing with milk and honey. Our ancestors came and conquered it and lived in it, but they refused to obey or follow your word. They have not done anything you commanded. That is why you have sent this terrible disaster upon them." So he's kind of going back into that whole thing of, well, here's where we are. But he remembers that God saved them from Egypt and that God gave them the promised land. And then he says, "See how the siege ramps have been built against the city walls. Through war, famine, and disease, the city will be handed over to the Babylonians who will conquer it. Everything has happened just as you said." So Jeremiah is recognizing where he is, remembering the character of God, recalling God's track record, and he's asking the question, what's going to happen next? And he continues with this, "And yet, O sovereign Lord, you have told me to buy the field. You have told me to invest in this situation. Why in the world would a person invest in such a dire situation? Why would a person put money down on a piece of land that is about to be conquered by the Babylonians? Why would he do that? Because he trusts in God. Because he trusts in the character of God. Because he trusts in the track record of God. And he's putting his hope in the future. That's exactly what the psalmist does in Psalm 33. The psalmist in Psalm 33 says, "The Lord looks down from heaven and sees the whole human race. From his throne he observes all who live on the earth. He made their hearts so he understands everything they do." God sees exactly our situation. God knows when we have spun off the road and we are stuck in the snow. God knows what has happened in the story of this church. God knows what happened to the Israelites in Jerusalem when the Babylonians were on their way and what they did afterward. God knows all of that. The best equipped army cannot save a king, nor is great strength enough to save a warrior. Don't count on your war horse to give you victory. For all its strength, it cannot save you. It's a good reminder because sometimes when we spin off the road and life goes crash, our impulse is to try to fix it ourselves. And what the psalmist is reminding us is that we cannot save ourselves. We can't. But the Lord watches over those who fear him, those who rely on his unfailing love. He rescues them from death and keeps them alive in times of famine. We put our hope in the Lord. He is our help and our shield. In him our hearts rejoice, for we trust in his holy name. Let your unfailing love surround us, Lord, for our hope is in you alone. When we spin off the road and we get stuck, we need to remember that our only hope is God. God is our hope and our shield. We are being asked to consider 5 prescriptions for our church. We are being asked to vote on whether or not to do those 5 things. Those 5 things are clarifying our mission and our vision, and aligning our staff and our leadership and our ministries to that vision. It's about examining our Sunday morning experience, making sure that what we do from the time somebody gets to the parking lot to the benediction and everything else that happens on Sunday morning is in accordance with that vision. It's about identifying a clear discipleship pathway, making sure we understand as a church how it is that a person becomes a disciple of Jesus Christ when they come here. And the last one is building bridges to the community. We are being asked whether or not we want to do those 5 things, whether we want to say yes to doing those 5 things. And if we say yes, then we will have help and we will implement those 5 things. What's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? When I looked at all these prescriptions, and I've read over this report, I don't know how many times I've read over this report, what I realize is that there is one person in this church who is going to have to work harder than everybody else. There's one person in this church who is really going to be held responsible for implementing those 5 things. Me. And when I look at it and I start adding up the cost and I start figuring out what is this really going to cost me personally, what would it take for me to be able to lead this church through those 5 things? I can't do it. It's too much. I cannot, in my own strength, accomplish it. It could tear up my family. It could destroy my life. It could ruin my career. But God can do it through me. God will do it through me if we choose to do it. God will do it through you if we choose to do it. God is our hope. He is our hope and our shield. His love is unfailing. When my son Scott was about 3, he's a cute kid, but he was even cuter when he was 3. And when he was about 3, he and my wife Amy were watching one of these kid shows. You know those kid shows where they'll have like cartoons and then they'll switch over to real film and they'll show like people doing things like, they'll show a teacher or they'll show a carpenter or something like that and kind of give kids a picture of what it might be like to be an adult. And so he was watching one of these shows with Amy, and there was a scuba diver. And this scuba diver was about to get into the water, and he turned to the camera and he said, "It's a little scary, but exciting." And so Scott, when he was taking a bath that night, he was taking his bath, and he sat up on the edge of the tub, and he turned to Amy and goes, "A little scary, but exciting." And that's how I feel. And maybe that's how we all feel. It's a little scary, but exciting. When we ask the question, what's going to happen next? When we as people of faith ask that question, we should feel a little scared, but excited. Because when the people of God put their faith in God and trust God to work through us, it's exciting. It's a little scary, but it's exciting. We were in that Jeep, or I was in the Jeep. I was sitting behind the wheel of that Jeep, and it was pointed up like this. And I had shifted into 4 low, and I put the gear into first gear, maybe second gear, I can't remember. Sometimes it works better to do second, but anyway, that doesn't matter for now. And I put it in gear, and I began to feather on the gas, real lightly but confidently, and to let out the clutch real slow. And as I did that, the wheels of the Jeep bit into the dirt and the grass and the snow and the ice below. And the Jeep started to just kind of creep up the hill, just one little bit at a time. just one little bit at a time, it started to climb up toward the road. And I had this thought as I was kind of making my way up. I had this thought, which was, let's not step on the brakes. What would happen if I stepped on the brakes? I would have slid back down and probably then some. It's not a good thing when you're barely climbing uphill on a slippery kind of dangerous slope. As scary and exciting as that is, it is not a good idea to step on the brakes. You know, we as a church, we've started to kind of creep up a little bit. We've started to sort of climb the hill. In the last 2 years, we've seen a bump in worship attendance, the first bump that you can see on a bar graph in a decade. The finances have kind of started to climb. We're starting to climb. But church, let's not step on the brakes. Let's not step on the brakes. Is the future filled with hope? Our God is a God of hope, a God of unfailing love. Is our future filled with hope? Yes. Amen.